So, audience participation. How many people here would prefer not to have poisons in their food? Yeah, I would have answered the same thing, but it was a trick question. Okay. So Paracelsus was a 16th century mystic, alchemist, physician, theologian. He was insufferably arrogant and perpetually drunk, apparently, and also occasionally brilliant. He anticipated the germ theory of disease, and he also formulated this concept that the dose makes the poison. It's now a basic and has remained a basic tenet of toxicology ever since. What it basically means is that there's no category of chemicals or substances of any kind that is poisonous and one that is not. Everything at a low enough dose, depending on the substance, there's always a low enough dose that it will have no biological, physiological effect on the organism, you, whatsoever. At a high enough dose, everything is poisonous. Turns out that every substance in the world, at least that's ever been tested so far, conforms to this. So, for instance, a little bit of arsenic, you don't need very much, and it will kill you, right? But there is an amount of arsenic that you can ingest that will have no physiological or no detectable physiological effect on you whatsoever. Water is essential for life. Drink too much of it, and it basically shuts down your brain. You can't pass electrical impulses through your brain, and you die. So water is toxic at a high enough level. It's apparently true of everything, not just substances. It's true of sunlight, necessary to create vitamin D, but you don't get enough of it. So you need, but you get too much of it, you get skin cancer. It's true of electricity. Your body produces electricity. You can't live without it, but you get hit by a lightning bolt, you're dead, right? It's true of nuclear radiation, in fact, although our regulators specifically deny that fact, but it's almost certainly true that at a low enough dose that a radiation has no adverse effect and may even potentially have a beneficial effect. The same thing is actually true. I mean, not every substance will give you cancer, but about half the substances that ever have been tested well at a high enough dose produce cancerous tumors in laboratory rats. So these are just some of the substances that you eat every day in a healthy diet that are carcinogenic in that respect. And it's pretty much anything you might eat, and certainly anything with any vitamins in it, but it includes bread, and of course it includes coffee and tea. Same thing is true with endocrine disruptors, and true of in a variety of other ways. Now, with endocrine disruption particularly, that's a political term, disruptor. They were originally called modulators, but activists who wanted to ban particularly pesticides, which is what I'm going to be focusing on, developed this idea that this dose-response curve was, in the case of endocrine disruptors, reversed. So you could have, at a very small dose, something that was incredibly harmful to you physiologically, but at a higher dose, this would not show up in the regular toxicology tests. This would seem to be confirmed by a test, a study done in Tulane University, which sparked legislation, created this multi-million-dollar program at EPA that is still going on. That study was later retracted, and the scientists disciplined for outright fraud, and in fact, no such reverse dose curve has ever been found, but those programs are still going on, and they're still scaring the bejesus out of people with things like BPA and other chemicals that are actually when you consider how potent they are and how much of it we ingest or otherwise are exposed to, are millions of times less powerful than what you're going to have, than what you're going to ingest with a plate of cabbage, which of course is pretty toxic. But let's say like something like asparagus. So the problem with this is that for 60 years, really, since the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, we have been subjected to such a barrage of propaganda and scare tactics that at this point, the public understanding of these issues has completely eroded. And we have whole regulatory systems, particularly the EU, but also in California to some extent, increasingly so, based on the proposition that this dose curve doesn't exist. That if something is carcinogenic at massive levels, right, any molecule of that substance will be carcinogenic to you. And that therefore, exposure doesn't matter. The likelihood that you'll be exposed to it, how much you could possibly be exposed to it, none of these things matter. It must be banned. The way the EU regulates pesticides, if a substance is found to be carcinogenic by sticking a gavage tube down a rat's throat and literally pumping solution of that substance, usually dissolved with a special solvent, because mostly they can't get high enough doses dissolved in water, into the rat's stomach, and you do that day after day after day, and the rat develops tumors, that substance is carcinogenic and it is banned. Which puts the EU in the somewhat absurd position that if wine growers decided that they wanted to use wine, vineyarders decided that they wanted to use wine as a pesticide and were to spray it on their grapevines, it would have to be banned because it's an obvious carcinogen. So the EU has been moving down this path for over a decade now. But recently during COVID, well, the rest of the world the economy was being turned upside down, people were being locked down. The European Commission made it very clear that its number one priority was still this thing called the farm to fork, which was to institutionalize this, right? And not only that, accelerate the adoption of it in various ways, primarily by banning 50% of all pesticides used in the EU within 10 years. And they made a promise to use I went too fast, to use their clout in all of the international regulatory and trade regulators to impose these policies on the rest of the world, and they're making good on it. They've already started banning imports from the United States on this basis, and they have essentially they've also got a good part of the international organizations like the FAO, which is a really important partner in the Green Revolution in the 1960s, has for the last 10 years been telling people that the Green Revolution was a mistake, created horrible damage, and needs to be reversed. The buzzword that they've chosen, the new buzzword, is agroecology. And you can't make this stuff up, but they explicitly promote what they call peasant agriculture, indigenous agriculture. It's very clear that it's basically organic plus, meaning no synthetic pesticides, not really, no pesticides that aren't approved for organic use, but organic farmers use loads of pesticides. They in fact use more of them often than conventional farmers. They're just older pesticides that are less targeted, often more toxic, like copper sulfate. And others, neurotoxins, they're just derived from natural plants in some cases. But it's organic plus, it's about food sovereignty, meaning that all of your food needs to be grown in they're against trade. They explicitly talk about how they're going to transform not just food systems, but capitalism itself, whole societies through this means. And the FAO has been engaged in this process now, probably since around 1912, when this guy took it over. He's a communist from Brazil. He took it over and he just completely changed the direction, and they have been spending the last 12 years telling Africans not to use pesticides on their crops, but to pick the bugs off by hand instead. It's probably why, for instance, a direct result of these kinds of policies, although you may have missed it, was the complete collapse of the Sri Lankan economy, when the leaders of Sri Lanka actually took the advice of people like the activists who were promoting this and the European Union and the FAO, and they instituted an organic regime which did away with synthetic fertilizers, did away with synthetic pesticides, and their economy, which had been built up on tea and other agricultural products, collapsed, and people were actually starving in Sri Lanka. Didn't get much notice here, and it didn't even, not a blip in Europe, not a reconsideration. They have been promoting these with the most outrageous propaganda and scare tactics, together with millions of dollars from American NGOs in Africa to convince farmers not to use pesticides, which is one reason they were so unprepared a few years ago for a once-in-a-lifetime locust invasion. To give you a sense, the money comes from a number of sources. In the EU, it's actually government money that funds all of these NGOs, some of which you could see on the previous slide. In the United States, you have some from predatory trial lawyers. You have some government money. Most of it is private money. Most of it is donations from large foundations, some of which, again, like the Ford Foundation, were critical in the Green Revolution, but they've turned around, they're now moving the other way, and they're all giving their money to these people. This is an anti-GMO tracker, right? So all these people are anti-GMO, they're anti-gene editing, both of which are still not allowed in the European Union, and which the FAO militates against. These are just some that we're giving to the NRDC. This is just one. It's on the Genetic Literacy Project. It's an extraordinary, and these are just people who are giving to the GMO labeling campaign, which was clearly an attempt to kill GMOs in this country. So why am I focusing on pesticides, right? Because nobody else will, right? It is the technology. It's like the Voldemort of technologies. It's the technology that nobody wants to speak about. So even the proponents of growth and of progress almost never mention this, but it is perhaps the most important technology of the 20th century. Certainly it had one of the largest impacts on public health ever. This is like, talk about superabundance, right? These are just two graphs from the Our World in Data, which is great. And actually, if you get the data and you break it down, it's even more dramatic. But I call these my hockey stick graphs, right? Because you've got, for centuries, basically flatlining on productivity in agriculture. And then at that point, everything turns vertically up. What is that point? That point is right after World War II when the modern chemical pesticides came on the market for the first time. Almost nobody mentions this. They talk about synthetic fertilizers, which were actually used before the war, although they were much more widely distributed and available afterwards, it's true. Hybrids. Henry Wallace, the communist vice president of Franklin Roosevelt, he started Pioneer Company. He had commercialized hybrids back in the 20s, I believe, right? By World War II, something like 90% of all corn farmers in America were using hybrids, and you can see it made a difference. And they were critical to this post-war explosion of growth. But the thing about it was that both the productivity-enhancing effects of these new hybrids and the fertilizer, which made you able to pack more crop into each acre, also made it much more inviting to pests. So that without the new pesticides, many of these traits would have been actually counterproductive. Another thing that came somewhat as a surprise to me is that malnutrition before World War II was widespread even in Europe and the United States. I didn't know that. I was never taught that. I had no understanding of it, and it's actually pretty hard to find this information. But this is from a League of Nations report in 1935, and they make it very clear that, yeah, things were worse during the Depression. A lot of people were out of work. That made things worse. But malnutrition had been pervasive among the working classes, people with a job in the most industrialized, most advanced nations in Europe and in the United States before the Depression. And this is malnutrition that's defined in 1935 terms. So you can imagine today what would be considered 13 studies in the United States by the Bureau of Labor Statistics and also the Bureau of Home Economics, which I hadn't actually known we had a Bureau of Home Economics, but found that it had been widespread, averaging about a third of all children since the beginning of the century. That's a distant memory. It's not even a memory. That's so distant that we assume the productivity of our food system is a given. It's not. The thing about the food we produce is it's fundamentally unnatural. Almost everything we've eaten, everything we eat has been bred over millennia by farmers to make them more productive for food, right? But they're not bred to survive very well in the wilderness, and they're just a great target. I mean, they're for pests, for something like 90,000 different worms, nematodes, insects, bacteria, viruses that will either infect them or eat them before we do, and any number of weeds, very aggressive weeds, that will outcompete them for space and light and land. These are estimates, which, by the way, were done 20 years ago. I want to speak to that, of just what the crop losses would be if we didn't use pesticides. It would be devastating. We would have the famine that Paul Ehrlich spoke of. Hundreds of millions of people would have died. He was right as far as that went. They would have died if it hadn't been for Norman Borlaug, the father of the Green Revolution, who created many of these hybrids that enabled countries like India to go from chronic malnutrition and even famine and periodic famine to become food exporters. And he was very clear that none of this would work without pesticides. He called Rachel Carson's Silent Spring diabolic. He said if organizations like the National Resources Defense Council, which was around at that time in the Sierra Club, got their way, hundreds of millions of people would starve. And by the way, as people are absolutely right about globalization, it's lifted hundreds of millions out of billions out of poverty. It's been, due to Ronald Reagan's policies, supply-side economics, the 1980s was probably one of the greatest periods in terms of human uplift in the history of the world. But it does, one of the downsides, which was happening anywhere, but it was accelerated, is the spread of these invasive species. And they are death to agriculture. You're not going to have bananas soon, because the Cavendish banana, which is like almost everything that all the bananas that we eat, are about to go extinct, or at least that strain of it. And bananas, am I getting toward the end of time? Okay, I'm going to move quickly along. So this is where we are, in terms of toxins, in terms of pesticides in your food. So this is a USDA study. It's down 98% since the 1960s, since like Rachel Carson wrote her screed. The persistence in the environment has declined the amount used per acre has declined 60%. So somebody do the math. I don't know what that is in terms of your actual exposure. And they don't last very long in the environment, about 40% less than they used to. And somebody I know, a plant pathologist, did a study of pesticides used in California, which is a very big, largest agricultural state, very diverse, use all the different kinds of pesticides. Basically, 97% of them were less toxic than coffee. So just so we know, and you're also, to the extent that you're exposed to them at all, which is often you're not, because much of your food doesn't have any residues at all, and when they can detect it, they often can't measure it because it's so small, and when they can measure it, you're talking about parts per billion, parts per trillion often. I'm going to go over this quickly, but if you care about the environment, I care about the environment, not so much about greenhouse gases, but I do care. The most important thing for the environment is saving land. If we farmed the way we did in 1961, if we took the advice of the FAO and of the Europeans, right, we would need a land area the size of Russia. That's 2 times the land area of the lower 48 states, just to grow the food that we have, extra land area that we have today. Farmers today they're growing 3 times as much, 10% less land area much greater than the whole state of California. Organic farming, whatever else, they do use pesticides, lots of them, as I said, they're just 30 to 50% less productive. So if you're going to grow the same amount of food, you need that much more land. And the only study that's looked at greenhouse gas emissions, if that's a concern, has found that when you factor that in, that you're going to be like leveling the Amazon rainforest, you're going to be plowing marginal land, all of the greenhouse gas emissions, it's going to be 50 to 70% more. Final slide. Okay, so what's happening? Declining productivity. We're not, this it has an effect, and many of the policies, which I haven't had time to get to in detail, but glad to talk about them at some point if there's interest, are just, this whole area is so overregulated, it's regulated so irrationally in so many cases that we no longer can innovate the way we used to. We don't have the kind of innovation that brought toxicity down 98%. We can't bring these new things to market. It's fantastically expensive. And we're just kind of running out of compounds that seem to be working. We're not going to starve, but others are. We're not creating the kind of productivity growth in agriculture that we need to keep pace with population. We have 8 million now, just now. 20 years, we're going to have 2 more billion. Sorry, 8 billion, 2 more billion. We can't grow the food to feed them at present levels, let alone with good nutrition and at adequate nutrition. So I will stop there and answer any questions.
Can we give him a round of applause?
The question?
Yeah.
Did I take up the whole thing?
No, I think it's okay. We'll take a question here.
Hey.
Thank you very much, Josh, for doing this because it is a very neglected topic. I don't eat organic food because of the balance between natural pesticides and synthetic pesticides. The work of Dr. Bruce Ames and Marjorie Gold, who developed the Ames test for mutagens and carcinogens, has somehow almost disappeared. And I don't have the accurate information anymore, but do you know the consumption per day of synthetic pesticides versus natural pesticides? It used to be, I think, around 1 milligram per day of synthetic, but 1,500 milligrams of natural pesticides.
Yeah, it's something like that. It's thousands of times more. It's like with endocrine disruptors, and they're often much more, to the extent that they're carcinogenic, much more carcinogenic than the ones that are synthetically produced. There's this assumption that nature is always benign, always wonderful. Something that's natural is better for you than something that's man-made. There's no rational reason to ever believe that. Diseases are natural. Obviously, that's not true. There are a lot of natural things. Yeah, so, and in terms of organic food, I should say, you know, just so you know, they use highly toxic pesticides. It's not adequately regulated. It just simply isn't. I mean, this is how regulation works. You think it's consistent, you think it's irrational, you think it might be rational, you think that the amount of regulation might be proportional to the actual risk. If you did think that, which I might have before, you'd be wrong because it isn't. The European Union has copper sulfate on its list of substances that they want to cancel. It's highly toxic to the environment. I mean, it persists in the soil literally forever. It kills anything it touches. It's not targeted at all. It's probably carcinogenic. It has all sorts of neurological effects. But they've said we can't ban it because organic farmers depend on it. But unlike the synthetic pesticides that are used, which USDA goes around every year and tests all of your food to make sure that it doesn't raise above these tiny, tiny parts per billion, that there would be anything that might conceivably, with massive buffers, 1,000 times, of anything that might possibly produce some kind of adverse effect. They do that with the synthetic pesticides. They don't test the organic produce. And by the way, organic is a complete scam. Most of the organic that you eat is not grown organically. It's coming out of Turkey. It's coming out of Ukraine, or was before the war. It's coming out of Russia. It's coming off of farms. They're conventional farms, so it's probably okay. There is no way to know because part of the way, first of all, organic farmer, basically the whole organic industry regulates itself, which is not what the conventional agricultural industry does. They don't. EPA regulates them. They basically decide what they can use, what they can't. And they've decided that if China tells us that they have an organic certification, we'll accept it. So if you feel very confident about the organic food that's being grown in China, that it doesn't have lead or something actually highly toxic in it, that's great. But otherwise, I don't eat organic if I can possibly avoid it for that reason.
Let's do one quick question and answer.
Actually, two quick questions. Was that graph, is the United States production going up or down? Productivity?
It's about even, but it's not progressing. I mean, you know, I think, you know, the question to all these is like, you know, what George was saying, notwithstanding about healthcare, it's not that we're like, if we're doing better than a king in the 12th century, it's what are the opportunity costs of this system? And they're huge here. They're absolutely, first of all, we have no development of animal GMOs. It took 20 years to approve the GMO salmon, right? It's the FDA, which took this over, they regulate animal GMOs as a drug, which put them in a really as an animal drug, which means it can't kill the animal that you give it to. I mean, it's not as tight as with human drugs, but they're pretty tight. So that was a kind of a conundrum to them when Oxitec developed this mosquito that basically would breed with other mosquitoes and all their offspring would be sterile. Pretty nice if you're dealing with, mosquito vectors of diseases, right? But they couldn't get it. They couldn't get past the approval process because of this catch-22. You couldn't kill the mosquito. You couldn't render it sterile because that would be a drug that killed its host, right? It's totally irrational, but that's in place now. If you wonder why we don't have any animal GMOs, that's one of the big reasons. Everybody thinks that gene editing is going to somehow get a pass. Well, it did. In the horribly anti-science Trump administration, they made clear that they were going to they were going to regulate according to the risk of the product, not the process, which makes absolute rational sense. The European Union doesn't do that, and they're attempting through the WTO, through all of these international organizations, to prevent our farmers and Brazil's farmers and any other farmers to close their market, which is the largest consumer market in the world, or the largest economy in the world. It's one of the largest, to anybody who uses these products.
Where is this research available?
I'm sorry, what?
Where is this research available?
Which research? Which research?
Your research.
From me.
Okay.
I mean, I can. I'll have to put hyperlinks on it and everything, but I can get it to you very easily if you're interested. Sure.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Okay, well, Dan Mader is a sponsor, so he gets special privilege. But go ahead. But we'll do a quick question.
Well, I've been here for a day and a half, and it's probably one of the few presentations I understand a little bit of. I'm actually in agriculture in Idaho, so I'm pretty familiar with part of what you're talking about. I really wasn't aware of this movement in Europe to go back to this primitive way of agriculture. But this summer, I noticed in a very remote news site that there was a bunch of protests going on in Europe with some farmers. And so I kind of dug into it to see what they were protesting. And it turns out that the regulations from the European Union have already mandated that they cut their fertilizer, in this case, input by half, and now they're telling them they have to cut it by another half. So the farmers are saying, well, the problem with that is if we did what you ask us to do, we wouldn't make any money, but even worse than that, we couldn't feed Europe. And it doesn't seem to be carrying the day. Now, I'm pretty aware of what happened in Sri Lanka, and so I'm kind of watching for it here, and I have to interact with regulators here. And we're not seeing that in the United States yet. But you just kind of wonder.
So I didn't get to that part of my talk, but we're beginning to see it, right? So, I mean, nobody again seemed to notice, but our whole regulatory system for these pesticides just got blown up by a combination of the Ninth Court of Appeals, California, Northwest, your Court of Appeals, the Biden administration, and a Supreme Court that clearly didn't understand the import of this case and so decided not to hear it and let the Ninth Circuit's decision stand. And that basically what that does is reverse decades of precedent which said federal regulation of these things, which are traded in interstate commerce and critical for all of this stuff, federal regulations take precedence over state regulations. That's just been thrown out the window because the justices decided not to hear the case. The Ninth Circuit decided that it was actually Bayer versus, it was one of the first glyphosate suits, tort cases against glyphosate. The California law prevailed in this case, which means California and the California legislature and whatever harebrained law they decide to pass, maybe it will be a proposition like Proposition 65, which labels everything carcinogenic, because it is according to those criteria. Anything they decide to pass is going to essentially become national regulation, because Certainly, no pesticide manufacturer is going to spend 13 years and about $200 million, which is what it costs to get one of these new pesticides to market, so that California can ban it, which they're about to do. The promise to do, the legislature is now, and the California equivalent of the EPA, is looking at, they're trying to pull a Europe. They're trying to do a Europe. They're going to ban 50% of all pesticide use in California. They haven't decided which 50%, but they're going to do it. And by the way, this isn't going to happen all at once, and Europe doesn't do it all at once because they don't want the whole thing to fall off a cliff. Like the mistake that leaders of Sri Lanka did is they didn't understand that this is all a scam, right? So they just did it, and their economy collapsed. But in Europe, what happens, France, which is the leader of this, all of this insanity, so they got this critical insecticide ban, the class of insecticides called neonics, because it apparently was going to wipe out all bees, even though bee populations have been increasing for decades and decades. Okay, so they ban it, but then their sugar beet crop, which has happened to be important to them, was about to collapse because there was nothing to replace it. So every year they give themselves what they call a derogation, which means an exception. So they use it year after year after year to save their sugar beet crop, ban it for everything else, which they consider non-essential, right? But if you're a company trying to innovate in this kind of environment, you don't do it. You can't do it. There's no way to do it. There's no possible way that you can have any assurance that the next pesticide that you produce isn't going to be banned. And I haven't gotten to this either. There are other things the Ninth Circuit has done. Anyway, so it's coming at us from every which way. And a big part of this is the decline in standards in terms of what peer review and what is published, and in the what is published as science in these scientific journals by a lot of academic scientists. Brilliant. Everything I've heard here is brilliant, but I'll tell you, in my world, the level of mediocrity is utterly astounding, what's produced and what's published even in some of the leading scientific journals. So you've just got very low, it's not a good prospect to be you're not in a great, being a farmer right now is going to be really tough. And
well, one of the issues that we're dealing with that is compounding.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
What you're talking about is that the weeds that we've been fighting against are adapting to the compounds that the companies have given us, and now the pipeline is slowing way down, and now we're losing the battle because these weeds have adapted.
Yeah,
we have what we call pesticide rotation, so that we got all these protocols we're trying to use to stay ahead of the curve, but it's an enormous problem. On the fertilizer side, with all the regulations they're doing in Europe, we can only feed half of the world's population without fertilizer. The other half, if we're going to feed them, we have to have fertilizers. So I hear what you're saying, and I'm glad somebody's talking about it.